Slavery was one of those issues that always lurked in the background at the convention. It is obviously an institution that early on in the history of the country created a lot of animosities, a lot of deep feeling and concern. Even those who held slaves, and some of the convention did, including Madison, recognized the immorality of the institution. But you've got to also recognize that for the South, it was essential to the economy. It's hard for us to even begin to understand that. We tend to judge it by our own standards. But, slavery was one of those issues that the South built its economy on. And so it was not easily dismissed, even though it was recognized to be immoral by many.
It's pretty important to keep in mind when thinking about slavery at the Constitutional Convention that none of the delegates went to Philadelphia to deal with slavery. They were there to build a government. And they kept coming upon slavery. It kept being relevant to the representation issue, to the regulation of trade, with the slave trade. So they kept bumping into it, and they would have much preferred never to have to talk about it. And when they ran into it, they suddenly found themselves on what James Madison identified quite accurately as the true fault line of American politics at the time, between North and South, between slave and free.
If you look at the Constitution itself, the word never appears. I think most of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention would have preferred if the issue were not there. They didn't come there to discuss slavery, they came there to create a nation. And yet they found themselves, as Americans still do today, forced to consider it, forced to discuss it, forced to deal with it. I like to describe slavery as our original American constitutional sin. It was a complete contradiction of everything we stood for. If you look at the soaring rhetoric that Jefferson wrote in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that it's completely a contradiction. And the founders knew this, even slave owners, people like Madison, people like Jefferson, they knew it was a contradiction, and they struggled their entire lives to deal with it.
There are a lot of people who consider slavery to be the original sin of the Constitution. The problem that we have to recognize with slavery is that the institution itself likely was going nowhere. Just about every state had slaves when the Constitution was ratified. Some were moving in the direction of abolition, but all of them had slaves. So as a consequence, the idea that slavery was going to be abolished in the Constitution was problematic. I certainly wish it had been, but it wasn't going to happen. Once we recognized that slavery was going to be a part of the new nation, then the question was, how do we deal with it? Different delegates had various visions of slavery. Even some of the delegates who were slave owners didn't much like slavery. At least they professed not to like slavery very much, but they recognized that it was a part of the American landscape. And as a consequence, they dealt with it as opposed to trying to fight to abolish it at that time. There, of course, were some delegates who said that they really wished that slavery would be abolished and tried at least to have those discussions. But those discussions didn't go very far.
There were many people at the convention, I would say most, the vast majority, who were morally opposed to the institution of slavery. But it was very clear that there would be no union if they tried to abolish the institution in 1787. And so what happened more than slavery disrupting the convention was that there was a tension between North and South all throughout the convention in terms of questions of representation and taxation, particularly because of the slavery issue.
Part of the issue with slavery and some of the issues that the delegates had to deal with were purely economic. Those economic decisions drove their approaches, the delegates' approaches in some ways, to the issue of slavery. In those areas where folks believed that slavery was integral to the particular economy, they protected it, and they protected it fiercely. In those areas where they believed that slavery was less important to the economy, it was less likely to be protected.
A critical moment for slavery to really send the convention off the tracks came about 2/3 of the way through the convention, when the delegates had gone off on sort of summer break. They'd taken 10 days off. They'd left 5 delegates back as a special committee to prepare a draft. They had adopted a bunch of resolutions about what the government should look like, but they didn't have a draft constitution. These are men who knew what a draft constitution looked like. They didn't have one, they needed one. And the draft constitution that was presented when they got back in early August had been dominated in its preparation by a fellow named John Rutledge from South Carolina, who was a very effective delegate, I think underappreciated for his impact on the Constitution. And his mission was to defend slavery. And the draft that they presented had extraordinary protections for slavery. Congress could not adopt restrictions on commerce by less than a 2/3 vote. There was a guarantee of the slave trade forever and ever for the importation of slaves. And there was a provision that provision of the Constitution could never be changed. So this slowly began to rankle with the other delegates. After a couple of days, Gouverneur Morris, he was from New York, although he was a Pennsylvania delegate there, got up and made what is sometimes called the first true abolitionist speech in American history. And he denounced slavery, which took some guts to do. Slavery was legal in 12 states. Only Massachusetts had prohibited it. He called it a curse of heaven that will curse the nation. And he demanded a vote on the subject, and the vote was all the delegates against him except Jonathan Dayton, who was the youngest delegate from New Jersey. Even John Dickinson of Delaware, who had freed his own slaves, stood up and began expressing discomfort with this draft constitution and its pro-slavery provisions that the Rutledge Committee had produced. And finally, seeing that this was all going south on him, Rutledge said, okay, let's have a special committee and we'll rethink this stuff. And the slavery provisions were ameliorated.
One of the questions that concerns Americans today is why the founders allowed the institution of slavery to continue. If you work through the convention and actually see what the arguments are, you see that the Southern delegates, especially from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, would not have joined the Union on any other terms because their constituents simply wouldn't allow it. And it wasn't the case that they made the argument that slavery was defensible. Many of them felt that slavery had been cast upon them, and it was an evil, although they called it a necessary evil. The question is, if the other delegates had abolished slavery, how many slaves would actually have been freed? You see, the answer is none, because the South, where the institution of slavery existed, would not have joined that union.